Oh, are these mine? Do I need to fill this out when I go back to you?
Yeah. And then just rip the top off. This isn't gonna take 2 hours either, is it?
Trust me, I'm not lonely. Even two. I've got all sorts of friends in my head right now with everything going on.
Right?
Give our initial thoughts. But that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, when
I
you,
don't know if we can give an explicit direction right now.
you support with things, I'm like,
This is,
hello?
Okay, we all just about
You pass these to Karen.
ready? I'm sorry, we can't pass notes while we're in class.
We're not in class yet.
No, Mr. Theodore.
No, call this to order.
The lady over to the left here, why don't we pass these notes to you?
that's,
It says, do you like me? Check yes or no. My daughter got one
she
of these.
paid me money too.
I would have checked it and handed it back. Oh, she paid you money. I think it was all on the record too, my wife.
They're gonna have to buy one, see if I can.
Yes, dear.
It's very much on my face.
I like that. You know how it goes.
Okay, we're shy of board member and a superintendent.
We're here.
Picky,
I just didn't even know they were in earshot.
I know it, gosh.
And nothing worse than a cranky chairman, huh?
You'll pay for that.
Can I have a new seat?
Okay, we all set? We recording anything here? Good afternoon. The board workshop for September 27, 2016 is now in session. Pam, roll call, please.
Mr. Craig?
Present.
Mrs. Belford?
Present.
Mrs. Henderson?
Here.
Mrs. Nisi?
I was always here.
And Mr. Ziegler?
Present. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. This workshop has been called to discuss capital allocation, capacity planning, impact fees. At this time, I'll turn the meeting over to Dr. Blackburn.
Mr. Ziegler and members of, are we on? Can you hear me? Okay. Mr. Ziegler, members of the board, and our attending and listening audience. We're going to go through, as you just mentioned, our capital planning, current and proposed capital allocations, impact fees, and essentially how we propose that we think about managing the growth and capacity that we have here in Brevard County. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dane, Mr. Theodore, right now, and then I'm going to come back later in the presentation.
Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Blackburn. Thank you, Board. I very much appreciate the time you're taking here to give us the opportunity to present these three important elements. There are a lot of slides here. You all have binders with a lot of slides, a lot of information. I'm going to go quickly through the slides. There's one critical slide in each of the three categories of capacity planning, capital allocations, and school impact fees that I'll concentrate on. But for the most part, I will go through the slides fairly quickly. There's questions at the end of each of the categories that if you would just save your questions till that point. There's also some supplemental information in your binders that is not in the actual presentation. That is detailed backup of some of the points in the presentation, and those are included in items 2 through 4. So the agenda is workshop goals. We'll go through those, and the three main elements: capacity planning, capital allocations, school impact fees. We will then be talking about future activities for these elements, and at the end of the workshop, we're going to request the board for specific recommendations. Okay?
And if I could just add into that, our primary reason for limited conversation on our part is to maximize board conversation and direction.
Okay. Workshop goals, capacity planning. We're going to be talking about 3 things under that category. I'm sorry, here. Capacity planning, that would be the process for capacity planning, how we do it, options to address capacity issues, and funding options to address capacity issues. So the next slide is under the capital allocations portion of that. We're going to be talking about the current 10-year capital funding plan, proposed capital allocation changes, and as a board request, the relationship of 10-year capital funding plan to the 5-year district facilities work program, which you will have before you as a information item at the next board meeting. Not this one tonight, but on October 13th. So we're going to be talking about school impact fees, and under that category, we're going to be talking about proposed school impact fee ordinance change, the proposed resolution supporting that ordinance change, proposed use of school impact fees, and alternative uses of school impact fees. Okay? So we would then go into our first main category, and that would be capacity planning. As a public school board, it is your basic requirement to provide a seat for every student that chooses to attend our school. In that regard, it's our responsibility to provide you with enough information to plan and fund all of those necessary seats. So under capacity planning, this is the workshop goal slide that you saw at the beginning of the presentation. We're going to be talking about the capacity planning process. That capacity planning process involves enrollment projections. That is the basis of how we start to do the capacity planning. We project enrollment and we try to address that projected enrollment over the next 5 years. We gather, as part of those enrollment projections, development information from the local governments. We look at birth rates and we look at mobility rates. Mobility rates are a combination of choice, how students move in and out of our schools for purposes of choice, and cohort survival. We look at, that's a process whereby if we have 100 students in our 3rd grade class, we would expect in our 4th grade class at that school 100 students. That doesn't always happen, so we call those mobility rates. We have 9 planning areas within the district because each of them have a little different birth rate, mobility rate, cohort survival. So we use those to try to anticipate differences from the beaches in Palm Bay and MIMS. So we do that pretty well. You'll see on the next slide that we have moved to a blended model. We used to have all of those projections come out of the financial group years and years, and they did a fabulous job in terms of the next year's projections. And obviously that's very important because you use those next year's projections to set your budget, right? You want to know how many students you're going to have next year. You want to know, even more importantly, how many students you're going to have in a specific school the next year, because that sets a lot of things. It sets your PAR for your teachers. It sets the budgets for many things at that particular school. So we spend a lot of time as a district and try to get input from as many people as we can to set that next year's enrollment projection. At the end of the process, we get input from principals, from the Leading and Learning area superintendents and their staff. We try to give input. Stephanie Archer gives input on the choice programs and the charter schools and what they're going to do to those projections. At the end of that process, there's a meeting of probably 30 to 35 people. Joanne, I guess Karen Strickland leads that. And they come up with enrollment projections. You can see here, and I don't know if I have a, well, I don't have a pointer, but you can see it says finance, and you'll see up on the slide there that the year one projections are the most accurate. As they go out, they get less and less accurate. Those blue slides, in fact, at the end of 5 years become the least accurate. On the other hand, the growth management, the GM, are what we do in the facility services. We contact those local governments. We put those mobility rates and local government development input into a software program that is pretty good at projecting enrollment projections in the out years. It's less effective in year one, but it's much more effective in years 2 through 5. So what we started to do a couple of years ago was take the best of both worlds and use the financial projections for the first year, and then we built on that with our projections for years 2 through 5. And we're pretty good. You can see that basically 5 years out, we're only about 3% off. So we have a high level of confidence in our enrollment projections. It varies by school, but again, we look at those in conjunction with the principals and the financial department. What we use is a graphic presentation to try to look at what those projections show are these capacity maps. And you've seen these before 100 times. What this one shows is the elementary capacity projection for 2020-21 based on last year's projections. And that is permanent capacity. The next slide that you have is what happens when we look at total capacity. Total capacity being the combination of permanent capacity and relocatable capacity of school. So what is that telling us? It says that basically if you look up north, I'm going to flip back and forth, there's permanent and there's total. It says that since nothing has changed there, we really don't have a lot of portables up north. What does it tell us in the central area? It tells us that we have a lot of portables in the central area, and it tells us we have a lot of portables in the south area. So total capacity is a function of moving portables in to accommodate students that exceed the portable capacity, or in reality, the effective capacity, what we call program capacity of a school, to service those students and programs. I'll flip quickly through the next slides. You'll see then that we have one for middle school, and we don't have a lot of portables in middle school, so I'm going to flip from the permanent to the total, and you can see that basically only one changes there, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So that means that we don't have a lot of portables in our middle schools, and what that does mean, if we start to go over capacity in our middle schools, we have the ability to move in portables to a certain extent. High schools, you're going to see pretty much the same thing. We only have 2 changing there. Okay, so that means we don't have an enormous amount of portables left in our high school. Okay, the next section is options to address capacity issues that were identified in that planning process that I've just gone through. And Dr. Blackburn, do you want to? Oh, let me, yeah, I'm sorry. Let me start this by addressing the assumptions that we make as we start our capacity, our options to address capacity issues. So those assumptions are some pretty basic ones that form the model of the options that we use to address capacity issues. The first is 90%. You've heard me talk about this for 10 years. Our schools are effectively full at about 90% on the average of our FISH permanent or design capacity. What that means is we offer programs, or we utilize the schools in such a way that when we get to about 90% of what the state considers full, we are effectively full, and you will see the principals calling for portable capacity to augment their permanent capacity. Some schools can operate above that. We have Viera High Schools operating at about 93 or so today. And some schools are comfortable doing that. Some schools, especially those that have large ESC programs, can get to 80 in some cases. So you have to realize that when we say this, it's an average. It's in some cases a goal that we may not be able to reach. In some cases, we can exceed that by 2, 3, 4, 5%. 25% maximum portable capacity. When we bring a portable classroom into a school, what we start to do at some point is stress the core capacity, and you've heard me talk about that many times. The core capacity being the dining areas, the cafeteria, the media centers, the spaces that are gathering spaces, sometimes even the administration to allow enough administrators in to service the students. So based on empirical evidence, what we've determined is that at about 25% of your permanent capacity, when you exceed 25% of your permanent capacity in portables, your school is designed for 1,000. Once you move about 250 portable seats into that school, you're going to start to have some issues with core capacity, with traffic, with parking. So what we have said as an assumption in our capacity issues, or options to address capacity issues, at 25%, we're going to explore other options. We're not going to bring in 40% of our enrollment in portable capacity. 50%. When we have a school that shows growth to the extent that that school needs more than 50% projected, its projected enrollment is going to exceed its permanent capacity by more than 50%, we would start to look for options that revolve around new permanent capacity, whether that's a portable or we start to look at new schools in that general area. But generally, you're going to see a lot of growth that starts to generate needs like that. And most importantly, we have looked at using total capacity as the base assumption for proposed attendance boundary changes, both for new capacity and for options to address enrollment projections that exceed those 25%. You'll see some of those options, or you have some in your book. That requires a policy change because by policy, we are obligated to do attendance boundary changes based on permanent capacity.
Before we go on to the next slide, as the near top says, assumptions. So any and all of those assumptions can be changed, but just understand that as we change assumptions, we would change the model that's being projected, or models that are being projected here. Go on to looking at the various options. You see there from numbers 1 through 6. Won't read them to you, but I'll go through each one of them in detail. If we flip to the next slide, slide 20, it is possible, option 1, to manage the growth, manage the capacity of the district via portables, bringing in additional portables to the tune of about $13 million worth of portables over the next 4 to 5 years, 155 portables. You have, board members, in your backup exactly which schools would receive those portables and in which years. And on each slide, each option, we discuss at a high level what some of the advantages and disadvantages are to that. So here is actually one of the least expensive options. Definitely a short-term solution with very little disruption in terms of children moving boundary to boundary. Actually, no boundary changes here. Primary disadvantage we see with this option would be what Mr. Theodore alluded to, and that is stress of the core capacity and perhaps parking and traffic issues around the community that would receive those portables. Option number 2 would be attendance boundaries. It is possible to manage the growth and capacity in the district 4 to 5 years out by simply changing boundaries. That would impact about 5,500 students. The cost would be a combination of capital and operating costs, primarily for busing. This recommendation does not include demographic impact to schools that would have to be studied additionally before we executed on one of those boundary changes. And looking at their advantages and disadvantages, I'll start with the disadvantage. Clearly, perhaps the most disruptive option on the table, but still possible. The backup materials that the board has received will show you exactly what some of those boundary changes would be.
Desmond,
Yes.
how could 48 schools be disrupted and not only be 5,500 students? That number doesn't make sense.
In your backup material, you will see that we are moving students either in or out of 48 schools, and the total of the movement is 5,500 students.
So it's not the entire school, it's like a portion of it, so you move
Like
100 schools.
100
kids from
here.
school one
I'll
to
give you an
school two.
example. So, for example, if we were to move boundaries, you see there where a school like Apollo Elementary would lose 120 students, but a school like Enterprise Elementary would gain 305 students. So through that movement, the total would be about 5,500. Option 3, again, keeping our minds open. Option 3 would include restricting choice significantly. 5,700 students, 77 schools would be impacted. Cost, very difficult to determine. However, the primary disadvantage to this option is that it would do nothing to reduce our capacity and manage the growth that we're here to discuss. But we still took a look at it. Next option would be classroom additions, potentially impacting 8 schools and costing near $28 million, multiple classroom additions throughout the district. Some of the advantages: intermediate term solution, one of the less expensive options, less expensive than new schools. One of the points here I will offer the board for consideration: in this option, you would actually see more schools, more communities receiving a facility upgrade, so to speak. And I know the board has received comments, I've received comments around community equity, and this option would allow for more communities to receive an upgrade. Disadvantages, again, back to the core capacity that Mr. Theodore mentioned, parking and traffic issues. We would still experience some boundary changes. And one disadvantage is the distance from the new addition to some of the new developments in the community would be a disadvantage.
So a possible increase in transportation.
Correct. Option 5, new schools. I'll explain a lot of stuff going on here. According to the data we have in our hands today, potentially one new school would be an option. There is some additional data pending that we've yet to receive that may substantiate the need for 2 schools. You see there the cost between $20 and $40 million. Talking about advantages and disadvantages, sort of the opposite of what I discussed on the previous option, and that is you would bring in new schools in close proximity to new development. Minimize busing, and you would address capacity issues at adjacent schools. The most expensive option that we have here would be new schools. and still some attendance boundary changes would be required, and this is not a near-term or short-term solution. We're talking 4 to 7 years from today if the board decided to go that route. And in the backup materials, you have examples of exactly where those new schools would be. One in the central area of the district, and then one in the south area of the district. You also have in your backup materials what those boundaries would look like and individual school impact. Last but not least would be option 6, which is essentially hybrid or combination of many of the options just discussed. 85 portable classrooms, plus attendance boundary changes, new capacity that would include school or additions. Cost there is still yet to be determined. The advantages there, short-term and long-term solution, we would delay the requirement for new capacity while we built our revenue sources, and we were not able to identify any disadvantages to option 6.
Your next slide is 26, and basically, going back to the workshop goals, we would be looking at funding options, this would be funding options for new capacity. We currently have the ability to use impact fees, school impact fees, by benefit district. We have the ability to use property tax, that's the ad valorem tax, that would be pending FDE approval of that. You can use debt. It's possible to take on new debt in terms of COPS or RANs or SBE bonds to fund new schools. Public-private partnerships could be an option as a lease. And obviously there are some other voter-approved sources such as GO bonds or additional millage that are options.
So essentially on this page, the first two, as the board knows, impact fees and property tax, are resources we have at our disposal today. The rest of the page, debt, partnership, and voter-approved sources are revenue options we do not have at our disposal. It would require voter approval or action by the board in the district. So at this point, Mr. Ziegler, if it pleases you and the board, we'd like to open it up for discussion primarily on the 6 options that were just discussed and hear from the board on your thoughts and your direction.
Anybody want to start with thoughts? Mr. Craig.
Well, since Mr. Theodore and I have spent quite a bit of time discussing this, it's probably relevant for me to start the discussion. First of all, thank you for bringing multiple options to the table. I will caveat by saying, while we hope to have some direction, I don't think 2 hours is probably going to give us the time to provide you specific direction. I think we probably all are going to, I have mulled over these numbers for, a good amount of time now, since we've just started discussing it, and I would imagine other board members would want to do the same and probably get some input from outside sources. But that being said, just a couple of the questions that I had were, first of all, how often, so we're all on the same page, how often are the enrollment projections done? Is it on a continuous basis? I know that I know who's doing the work. I know who's crunching the numbers. He does an awesome job. But how often is he presenting that so that you then take it to this group of 30 or 35 or whatever? How often is that done?
Once a year.
So once a year, we're continuing to update, and it's at a 5-year outlook, and it just is a continued 5-year
Yes.
rolling forward outlook. Okay. I just want to make sure we all are on the same page with that. In option 6, where we say, there's a combination of options there. Changing attendance, first of all, we say that there's no disadvantages. But included in the options is changing attendance boundaries. And back in option 2, changing attendance boundaries as solely making that an option is a major disruption, where do you consider, obviously you say there's none, so there's got to be some metric or some line that you draw that says if we disrupt the lives or the movement or the attendance of this many kids, it's not a disadvantage. If we disrupt this many kids, then it is a major disruption. So where is that line?
That's a very good question. The assumption here, first of all, the assumption on number 2 is that we would do nothing other than change attendance boundaries. You can get there, but the disruption to school cultures, to transportation, the time of transportation, to demographics, free and reduced lunch, we would be busing, to do that without doing anything else, you would be busing kids past 3 schools. You would actually reach up past 3 schools to get to a student and then bus a student past where he could walk to one of the schools and bus him to a student, to the school that has capacity. That is maximum disruption and what would be, I believe, considered unacceptable in terms of the disruption to our students, staff, and our public. In this particular case, what we're doing here is, do you recall we said at 25% of portable capacity, we would explore other options. Those other options, the first of the other options in the immediate future, next 2 to 3 years and possibly 4 years, would be to do a very small attendance boundary change to address the remaining issue that we had left. In other words, you would solve the vast majority of it with portables, and then if you had a tiny bit left, you would do an attendance boundary change. Yes, it's going to disrupt students and parents, but as a comparison to doing number 2, or bringing in more portables, we believe it would be the least disruptive of the options.
Okay, thank you. And then what was I going to say? Never mind. I've lost my train of thought. I'll come back.
Just to clarify, I think you're missing something here on new schools because you don't speak to disruptions of new schools. And if we're going to consider the disruption of the number of students, we got to see what that disruption looks like. Because when you put new schools, you're changing all kinds of attendance boundaries anyhow.
But everyone wants a new shiny penny, so they don't mind as much.
But it's still, if we're going to consider the number of students disrupted, that's still a comparison factor. Otherwise,
Yes.
We know that's going to happen. Anything we do is going to be a disruption. But if you're going to start looking at the number disrupted, we need to know what each option is. And I understood your number 6, by the way, where it said disadvantages none, as that you can't put your finger on specifically what the disruption is going to be, or the disadvantage is going to be at this time. Not that there's none.
There are compared to the other ones, there are relatively few disadvantages to this.
Mm-hmm.
You have a way to get to the funding, which I'll explain in a later section. You are bringing in what I would consider an acceptable amount of relocatable capacity. If you maximize it at 25%, you're minimizing your attendance boundary changes, all the while saving for the new capacity that I believe will be necessary 4, 5, 6 years down the road. So relative to the others, I believe that there are no disadvantages to this option. There are disruptions.
Okay, so new capacity, you're clarifying, is going to be necessary 4 to 6 years down the road.
Given the projections that we have now, I believe that while you can do it with attendance boundary changes and portables, that the least disruptive and our recommended option would be a blend of portables, some small attendance boundary changes, and then new capacity at the end of that process.
I agree, but my point is if you know we're going to need a new capacity within a reasonable time frame, 4 to 6 years, I would say is a reasonable timeframe, then that is the plan that we need to work towards. The question is, how do we minimize disruption, provide quality service until then, while that is our plan? And of course, I don't recall what last time it was 09, we did attendance, that massive attendance boundary. And I believe it was that we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't have to do it again for 5 years?
That's correct.
5 years.
And-
So at this point in time, if we were to start planning attendance boundary changes, they wouldn't take place until the 17-18 school year. And if we wanted to stick to our no more, not doing it again for 5 years, we would be out beyond the need of opening possibly those new schools. So it'd be a very short window, it would be two quick disruptions. Yes, granted, one would be for a new shiny penny. I get that. But so it's almost like let's work backwards a little bit, is figure out where we need to be, what we're going to have to do to solve the problem, and then how do we minimize disruption yet accommodate getting to that point.
We have done that, Mr. Ziegler.
Perfect.
And what I would say is, what you see are a couple of attendance boundary changes down south because we don't have we don't have the need for a school projected with our current enrollment projections, input from those local governments. If we believe that they will be more aggressive in their terms of their information to us this coming enrollment cycle, and that's why I'm saying I'm anticipating a need for a school in the South. If we all agree that there's going to be a need for a school in the South District, the West Melbourne area, we would not do those attendance boundary changes, but rather, because you're right, we wouldn't want to do an attendance boundary change and then 3 years, 2 years later, build a new school and do it again. So all you would do is add more portables, and I believe that you can add 30 or 35% of your capacity and relocatable if you know that you're going to solve that problem in 2 years. So what you see before you is the assumption that there's no new school down south and some attendance boundary changes, but we would not do that if new school went in.
Mrs. Henderson?
Okay, I have a couple of questions. First, I haven't looked through everything in here, but is there program information in here? For example, and you and I had talked about this, at Williams Elementary, there's 4 ELP classes that have 10 kids in it each, so they're taking up what is essentially 96 spots for 40 kids. And so, where do we have all of those programs, and is there a possibility of movement of those programs and keeping it more of a K through 6 school to make room for the K through 6 students? And so I would like to see some information on where they are, and then I would like to know if there's anything that we could do to,
You and I had talked about that.
Yes.
use that space more efficiently. Or,
Yes.
to try to get as many students in there. Now, you made comment of something that made me go, what? At 125%, portables to 125%, and then when it gets to 150%, I can tell you, I was at a school, or my kids were at a school, at 126% capacity, where lunches started at 9:40 in the morning and ended at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's pretty rough at 100, so I can't imagine would we have carts outside to start them before they even get in the school?
No.
For their breakfast or for their lunches, because they're
At
at 150%.
No, let me explain that. What I said was that if we project that there will be a need for 150% or more enrollment need, or enrollment projections
Okay.
show a need downstream in the next 5 years of 150% or more enrollment capacity.
So the use of the assumptions is not to allow these things to happen, right? Does that make sense?
Okay. So I'd like to get some information on those elementary classes for sure. And then let me go to page
While
Just
he's
a clip.
doing that, because, yeah, I actually asked you to look at what about building a self-contained for the ELP, the VPK, kindergarten, maybe even TK1, so we could fully utilize our elementaries here in this area and do something really unique for those early childhood programs.
Yes, ma'am. We have not gotten to that yet. I've given it to our planner as an assignment.
And while you're looking at that, could you look at to see if there's any empty buildings around that we could use for those purposes?
Do you-
You know, in the county or whatever.
You
I
mean
don't know.
convert a empty
Something,
Kmart?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure that would be cheap.
Well, I mean, while you're looking at options, we don't know what's out there. I'm just saying, maybe we need to look at those options. Just
You're exactly right,
Thank you.
because there is not,
Write that one down. No,
no, you're exactly right. And, you know, I have, it's been no secret, and I asked Mr. Theodore to, and I know we disagree on this, and that's fine, to look at this building. This building is set up, just to me, very well. And in fact, other planners that I've had come look at it have said, oh, absolutely. I mean, you could, and now.
And then we put everybody in here in portables?
Well, if
Okay.
that's what it takes. Or you go get Class A office space and you lease that for the administrative offices or whatever. I mean, there are multiple things that could be looked at. Now, Mr. Theodore did give me an estimate from BRPH, which, I'm sorry, I'd looked at that. I mean, and I took it to several contractors, like, who would spend $11 million to knock down half the building only to rebuild it again? That was what that proposal said.
Mm-hmm.
It said it was going to rip out all of the electric, all of the HVAC, tear down the back half of the building. That would make no sense at all. If the infrastructure of this building is that poor, then we should be leaving here ourselves, right? I'm sorry. I would just, but you know, I don't want to go down that down a rabbit hole there. But I think that we are missing an opportunity to truly look at alternative options. And if that means taking a small portion of this and making it a place where some of those programs go, like a VPK or some of those things that we can extract from other places, then absolutely we need to look at that. We need to be able to put a good plan forward utilizing the assets that we currently have before we start going and saying, hey, we really need to build more capacity, even though we've kind of got some empty space around, or we've got some ability to move things around, and I think you both are exactly right on that case.
So if I could, I heard from you, Mr. Craig, taking a look at space that we own, and then I heard a comment about an empty Kmart, looking at space we don't own, so just space in general.
Space in general.
Space in general, yeah,
Space in
absolutely.
general. You know, we don't care where it is,
Well,
or who owns it.
within reason.
We do for to it.
When you're finished.
Okay.
Mrs. Belford, I think, wanted to jump in here somewhere, too.
Oh,
You want to jump in? You've been quiet.
Is Ms. Henderson done?
No, I have about 6 more things.
Well, then I want to go before you, no, I'm kidding.
I thought we were bouncing around a little.
I just wanted to add to the VPK conversation, that's all.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add, because I have the early childhood thing was something I talked to Dane about, that early childhood and that early reading is just, I think we have a missing piece here that we could really gravitate to, that if we could pull out, I just wanted to add what I talked to Dane about, is I have a real passion for early childhood. And I know I'm only here a short while, but I just want to get up on my soapbox for a minute here, because we have overcapacity in this area. What I would love to see this district develop, and what I shared with Dane, is that if we could pull out, we have VPK, we have kindergarten, and we have this group this classroom that parents seem to not want to have, that I think is the best thing since sliced bread, is that's TK1. And I know Teresa Wright loves TK1. But we only have like one class in one elementary and one class in another. And parents don't seem to want to put their children in that. But if we had an early childhood center, where if kindergarten was a part of that and that TK1 was a part of that, I think parents would gravitate towards it, because it wouldn't be a retention. They'd see that program as, oh great, I get to keep my child here one more year. before going on to that elementary school. And I see those kids that we lose as parents push their kids on before they're ready. If we had that early childhood center and it was a part of that, I think it would be such a win-win for this district. I think it would be a showcase that other districts would come and see. And so as you're looking at this and looking at that VPK kindergarten and putting TK1 and ELP, I just think it would be such a, here I am talking with my arms, I just think it would be such a cool program. I know Teresa Wright would be jumping up and down. I just want to put that out there because I just think it would free up our elementary, 96 seats just in one school alone. And not only would it save us money, but to me, the biggest win would be a win-win for kids. It would really work for early literacy. And so now I'll be quiet and turn it back to Karen.
You know, one of the advantages of option one, you say, is less expensive, and I guess that is an advantage, but it's also a temporary solution of $13 million. So, you know, one of the things that had happened over the last 8 years since we've been here is we went from using portables all over the place to saying we really didn't want to use portables. Learning cottages, like, excuse me. Yeah, so now we're going to, you know, essentially we're going to undo that. We're going to go back another way. So it's sort of like the pendulum seems to be swinging. Just an observation. Also, you know, I noticed that you show elementary schools in this area as a potential option. First of all, if we got some of those classes out of there, maybe we'd have some room. But in addition, has there been consideration of a middle school 6 through 8? Then you would have all the 6th graders out of the overcrowded schools.
And you'd solve your elementary
And
program.
you'd solve your
while
elementary
providing
at least
middle.
for a while.
No, I was going to suggest that, because it looks like we did that before at Central Middle
Yeah.
School, and it looks like we have the capacity to even do it again at Central to free up and delay the need for additional capacity in the south area if we did that again. Has anybody ran those numbers to see if that's a possibility?
We have not.
And-
Mrs. Henderson mentioned the 6-8 option, and we have not run those
And
numbers.
just for historical reasons, it's factual reasons, it's my understanding we're one of the few districts in the state that doesn't have 6 through 8 for middle. So it's actually a standard design for those grade levels. And I remember when my daughter was in 5th grade at Meadow Lane, instead of going to 6th grade in Meadow Lane, she went to 6th grade at Central. And it was just amazed me, all the parents were up in arms about, you can't put my 6th graders with those 7th graders. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, they were just 5th and 6th together, now they're going to be 6th and 7th. I don't understand you at all. And it worked fine. It worked fine. I don't think there was any problem whatsoever with doing that.
And there are some advantages to it as well, programmatically, for 6th graders to be able to have access to some of the programs that are available in the middle schools now that we don't have that. So,
The curricular and the extracurricular becomes an
Exactly.
option for 6th graders.
Just one point, if I may. A 6 through 8 would be on the order of $35 million, as opposed to a $20 million elementary school.
well, I was looking at this what's the number of seats that you would be putting in there?
1,200 to 1,250.
Okay.
But I think, Mr. Ziegler, when you mentioned, I think what I thought you were saying was take a look at our current middle schools, explore taking 6th grade from the elementary, putting 6th grade in the current middle school.
Well,
No,
I was
there's not-
saying
there's not enough
specific,
room.
I don't know if
There's not
it'll
enough
work
room for that.
at Central it may work.
It may not work everywhere, but you're
At
saying
Central, I
take a look
think
at
it
that
might
as an
work. I don't
option.
think it'll work at Southwest.
There-
It might
And
even-
I'm saying
might even work
Hilda
at
is
South.
something different.
Okay.
The next one,
Yeah, it might work at Southwest also.
the option 2 of attendance boundaries, we just went through that. It was massive amount of work, to understand. It's a big job to do that. Restricting choice, I'm not even sure how that would actually work, because if you look at the things that I can get from David, the ins and outs of all the schools, 30 people leave to go to X amount of schools and 30 people come in, so it's sometimes a wash. Some schools end up with 20 more, some end up with 20 less,
Right.
whatever, but it's not really a real solution in my opinion. Not that I have one. Yes, I do. The additions, I do think that, it's kind of interesting because I was at a school this week that shows on here as like 90-ish%, but basically had to have 2 open houses because there just wasn't enough room and parking for 7 grades of parents coming in at the same time. So we already have those issues in some places, even when they're not considered over capacity or not using portables. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at some of these options. And 25, let me get you 25. 25. Again, this is another temporary solution, and I know in some places we're going to have to do some temporary till we may have to do some temporary solutions till we get there, but it is expensive to put in portables and the electric and the water and the covered walkways and all that stuff, and as a parent of a student who has been in portables or relocatables, as some people are learning cottages, we have our fair share of storms here in the afternoon, especially in the springtime. And, I just remember going to the school to pick up my kid, and they're all sitting in the hallway because they needed to come in at 1:30 for that storm that had lightning in it, so they didn't want to keep them out there because they knew it was going to rain by the time they dismissed. And, that's fine if you have 2 or 3 portables because you can probably line them all up on one wall or put them someplace, maybe share a classroom, but everybody is disrupted if you share a classroom. All those kids are disrupted. There was just hours and hours of learning time disruption, besides the fact that they have to go further and that sort of stuff. So it certainly is not my favorite option for students, but if you guys want to go to portables and make room for them, I'm good with that. So, and I am not prepared, as you said, to give out recommendation today. I think there's a few more things that you need to look at, and I would need some time to mull over and think more in depth on this and look at these. Okay, I'm done.
Mrs.
You
Belford?
okay?
Goodness gracious, thank
Finally,
you.
I know.
Yeah, we have any time left?
Shut up.
Okay,
Wait till the next one.
one thing along the lines of some of the things that have been mentioned of maybe looking at things differently or more creatively. For example, the early childhood center or the 6 to 8, that sort of thing. One of the options that we have up there is to decrease choice. But I wonder, did you look at the option of increasing choice? More specifically, if you look at the maps of the areas where you're proposing a new elementary school, there are schools around those schools that have capacity. So if we put in program options in those schools that have capacity that would draw folks from the overcapacity schools, that may also help us to balance some of those capacity issues. And I would think Ms. Archer would certainly be a better authority on that, but I would think that it would be fairly reasonable to survey those parents and see what types of choice options they would be interested in as far as programs, and try to develop something to entice those people to move away from the more congested area to the schools that have additional capacity available. That would also help us in increasing equity and access by offering some programs that would perhaps be attractive to the folks at the more overcrowded schools. So I would like for you all to perhaps collaboratively look at some options there as well. I do appreciate very much the fact that you all looked at kind of a hybrid model, because I do think that's what's necessary. I think we have to look at multiple options and not just go with one specific option, whether it be portables or new capacity. Or I think it's important that we look at all of the options and try to meld and make the best of all of those. One question, and I know I've posed this question to you and I think to Dave as well, is the question of, I know you put some information up there on accuracy of the projections, but am I correct in understanding that the accuracy of those projections are district-wide projections as opposed to school-to-school projections?
Yes.
So I too would like to see an analysis of the school level projections over time, because I will tell you, I went back and looked at, for example, this was the map that was put out during the 2012-13 when we were discussing school closures. And if you look at the colors on here and you look at the colors that we're currently looking at, there's some significant differences there. Now obviously there's been growth. But the other thing that I did was I went back and I looked at the actual projection numbers, and I only looked at a handful of the North Area schools because I just didn't have time to go into it in depth. Plus, I was manually entering everything because I don't have your fancy software, and I was pulling from multiple documents just to get an idea of what we were looking at. But you can probably see from there, Mr. Theodore, over here is the actual numbers we were looking at in 2012-13 in those schools. These were the projections that we had for 15-16 in 12-13. These were our 14 projections for 15-16. This is where we actually are, which is significantly different from here. And then this last one is what we're looking at for 2021. So my concern is that I don't envy you all of the job that you have to do in telling the future without the crystal ball. I get how difficult it is. And I certainly don't mean to slight the work that you all do, because I think it's fabulous work. At the same time, I think it's important for us to look at that process and see if there's a way that we can get more accurate on a school-by-school basis. Because when I look at the maps that are in the binder today, and I don't mean to be the school board member that's always looking backward, but I look at those maps and a lot of the problems we created. If you look, for example, at Pinewood, if you look at especially the North Area where we had closures, if you look at Cocoa, if you look at, there are a lot of places, and I'm not saying we did it solely because there was growth and there were other factors included as well. My concern is, as was mentioned previously, that we make sure that we're looking long-term. And if that means that we go back and we look and see how we can tweak our projections going forward on a school level, because really the decisions that we're being asked to make today in some way, shape, or form, they really are school-level decisions that we're making, and yet our projections on a school level haven't really been analyzed for accuracy. So my fear is that in making decisions without looking at the accuracy of that information, that we continue to create problems for ourselves down the line. And that's the last thing that I want to do. So if we could take a look, if you could provide that information for us on those projections, and I know, like I said, it's all fluid. I don't envy your responsibility in those projections, but I do think that it's important to at least look and see where we were and how spot on we've been on those school level projections.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think to that point, Mrs. Belford, there's a combination of long-term planning, but perhaps not too much long-term planning. So decisions that we make today shouldn't completely tie our hands for 5 or 6 years from now, because there's an element of error that we can just anticipate. I mean, they're good, they're going to get even better,
Right.
but there's an element of error that we just have to assume.
Well, and society, I mean, things change, economy changes. Lots of things are very fluid about that. But.
If I may, just to belabor that point for 1 second. What complicates the matter is our availability of choice. We can project students there based on an attendance boundary configuration, but if we allow choice at up to 100% of total capacity, which is what we're allowing now because of the policy change, what you find is students going to a school that we didn't anticipate and students not going to a school that we didn't anticipate. So that makes our projection accuracy very difficult going out 5 years.
Well, and for example, to speak to that issue, Mr. Theodore, going back to when we held all of those discussions about boundary changes in the north with the school closures, I don't think at that point any of us foresaw that Pinewood was going to be bursting at the seams. In fact, it was one of the schools that was initially on the potential closure list, in part of the cluster that was put out initially. However, part of it is growth in the north area. Part of it is people who are opting to go to Pinewood as opposed to another school that they're zoned for.
Yes.
Because of the perceived cultural shift that occurred in those other schools. And so that's why I say, you know, if perhaps we survey parents at those schools that are over capacity and see what it is they're looking for, then perhaps we can offer programmatic options that would help us to balance. Because like you said, there are numerous factors.
On top of that is, I'm assuming this data is actual capacity or actual utilization today, including our out-of-area, I'm going to always call it out-of-area, sorry, including our out-of-area students. And I guess one question would be, what would it look like? Because as these schools grow, they're going to be sent back to their home schools. What does the data look like if we rolled all of that back? Because that is part of the...
We don't get, they're there, and more importantly, to accommodate them, we'll bring in portables now to accommodate out-of-area
But
students.
we won't allow more out of areas in if we're over 90%. So
Correct. So
the
you'll
point
limit
being
them,
is
but you're
when
not
we
gonna
get to
send
that
them back.
90%, while you're not going to send them out, you're going to trick them out and not have more come in because you'll be sitting above that capacity. So the following year, you're not going to be accepting more. So the out of areas are going
That's
to go
correct.
down as the utilization
Our
goes up.
Our projections assume the number of out-of-area students there currently will continue to exist.
But not if you're over capacity.
Well, they're
Not if you're over
going to leave.
90%.
They're not
So
going
you're
to
going to
leave.
have, you're going to have like new people coming in, supplanting the, keeping more out of area from coming in. So
Correct.
if you don't calculate that, you don't know how long your current capacity is going to survive before it's really a problem. You're planning for that, for the need with out of areas, that number of out of areas constantly coming in. But that won't happen.
No, only, we're not planning for new out-of-areas. We're planning for the current out-of-areas to...
To
the
attrit
number,
out?
The number, yeah, well, yes, sir.
Okay.
Can I,
Mrs. Nisi had,
Well, since we were talking on the north area, and I have limited time to add my input to this, like I said, I'm going to get in my 2 cents worth on everything. I would like to add to the how to address the capacity issues in the north and the equity issue. I'm going to add what I've already talked to both of you about, is I believe we need to add a school of choice, an elementary school of choice to the north area. And where I think we need to add it is the school that we closed up there that's now Head Start, that has the Head Start and the adult ed. I believe we need to move the adult ed back to one of the high schools, say Astronaut. And we need to put in a elementary school of choice up there to address not only the equity, but some of the attendance issues we have up there. We're going to have a unique opportunity if all of the dominoes fall as we hope. We're going to be talking about the impact fees tonight, and we're going to be going from 4 districts down to 2. Hopefully, if the domino fees fall, there will even be a unique opportunity for some funding in place that I won't be sitting at the dais for, but there will be approximately $1.1 million in the District 4, if that's District 4, if their impact fee fund, that will need to be spent in District 4. So Mr. Theodore and I were talking, that has to be spent in that area. That can be spent on debt, but that means the money that was set aside to be spent on debt can be shifted to be spent on other things, such as a school of choice, moving the adult ed out of there. And I'm proposing this group that will be here at that time consider putting an elementary school of choice up in the north area. And that would address a lot of Mrs. Belford's concerns, that would address the attendance concerns. There's a lot of things that could happen in the north area. And since this may be my only opportunity to put my 2 cents in, there is, every day I keep reading about things that are happening up in Titusville, things that are happening in growth, things that are happening with new business coming in up there. And I think we have the building, we have the capacity, we have a unique opportunity with some dollars if the dominoes fall, as we hope they will. So since we're talking about capital, I just want to put that out there as part of capacity planning, because we do have some capacity issues up there. We can't go back and change the past. I also believe there were some mistakes made, but what we can do is go forward and fix the future. So I just wanted to, since we still have another 55 minutes to talk capacity, just add some more out there. So I
Mrs.
don't know if
Belford?
Thank you, Ms. Nisi. I very much appreciate your recommendation on that, as does the North Brevard community, I'm sure. And Ms. Archer and I have talked a little bit about that concept as well, and
So I throw
hopefully-
out a building, an idea, and even possible funding to go with it.
You're a star. Thank you. I appreciate it. Back to what Mr. Ziegler was discussing with you, Mr. Theodore, I think his point was if you have 5 out-of-area students in every grade, and this year we stopped taking out-of-area because we are at 90% capacity at a school, next year the 5th and 6th grade are going to be gone and we're not getting 5 more into kindergarten.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page on that as far as in and out. And I think that was all that I had on that issue. We can move on as far as I'm
I'll,
concerned. Oh, Mr. Craig.
Go ahead, Mr. Craig, and then I'll jump in.
Sorry, I just had, since Ms. Nisi brought up that option, one of the other issues that we've talked about is Cocoa High. For those of us who've been there know that it is bursting at the seams as well. Some of that is due to our own doing. Some of that is due to growth in programs that have been at that school for a long time. The principal does a great job managing that, but there is certainly, if we're going to look at projections and only concentrate on a couple of ones that are, and then in the Southwest, where really the projection doesn't support us actually doing anything down there, but we've, for some reason, I still can't wrap my head around that. Like why we are discussing an elementary school in the Southwest area when the projection numbers don't support it. We're just saying, well, we think we are going to. We're not really sure, and I know some of it is based on we're not getting the right number or what we think are the exact numbers from the planning agents in those communities. But certainly, if we have the numbers in front of us for things up in the north area and for around Cocoa, we need to look at that. And we have discussed this and as well, Mr. Theodore, and I know Ms. Archer has been involved as well, about figuring out some new student station facility in the Cocoa High School area as well, whether that is a new CTE program, some sort of physical addition that brings them a program of choice, brings them another learning option, and relieves what they have as far as a capacity issue. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we've had those discussions and they're continuing to look at those, as well as I didn't even think about that, but that's a great opportunity as well up in the north for an elementary option. So
I'll go ahead and I think adding choices is always a great thing to look at. And everybody says, why can't all our schools be choice? Well, that's because not every student, not every family is willing to make the commitment that we have at those schools. The catch, though, about building a new choice school is you're really not sure exactly where everybody's going to come from. So you don't really know where that's going to relieve pressure. You would hope there'd be an equal distribution in that area, and maybe we can make that speculation. One of the things I threw out before was that if we do need to more capacity in the South area, is one of the #1 elementary schools in the state is West Melbourne School for Science, which is also why we look at more choice. But of any school that might be worthy of a newer facility, I was thinking, what about looking at taking West Melbourne School for Science, building a new elementary school for that choice purpose a little more north of there, because I think there's such a draw to that school. I don't think it would change the attendance of that school, the dynamics of the school. I think everybody would still want to go there, so I don't think we'd lose any utilization of that, plus we can make it bigger, and then boom, you've got that facility right now in the south area that could be utilized as more elementary capacity. Just a wild thought I'm throwing out there, since we're talking about looking at choice programs to solve some of our problems.
Do we not have a new charter school going in down there?
Yes, we did.
Yes.
That's what I thought.
And what's its capacity?
450 at this moment.
Grades?
K-8. Pineapple Cove North, they're calling it. Sorry. It's Pineapple Cove Classical Academy North.
It's the one
They're
on
calling
the
it North. I am
agenda.
asking them to change their name because it is a little bit of a misnomer there, but it'll be about 450 students at K-8 configuration.
And do they have a location?
Not yet. No,
I
sir.
don't think so.
That's
But-
the one on our agenda, I believe.
Yes, sir, it is. I will
For-
tell you, they have the eye on the same
Same
property
property.
that we have our eye on,
Right.
so.
So, but, you know, we're going to have to, those things can happen anytime and change our projections. So I think makes that, looking at the middle schools for 6 through 8 even better because it's less disruption to boundaries, probably maybe even no disruption to boundaries. Minimal cost, and also gives us some breathing time.
Good call.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ziegler, if it, and the board, if it pleases you, before we move forward, one, Mrs. Amy, we're scheduled to talk about recommended use of District 4 impact fees, North Brevard type of option there, and we're scheduled to do the same thing with a COCO option later on in the presentation. Before we move on, though, looking at the 6 options we just discussed, one, we definitely appreciate the board is going to need more time. Right, we're slated to bring a final recommendation back in January. Between now and then, looking at additional board input and community input before we bring back final recommendations. To move forward, however, would it please the board if we could at this time perhaps eliminate options 1 through 3 from further conversation, or not?
Can we,
As
I don't know that I can.
Well, I would say option 1 is a pure solution, as that's it. I don't think that anybody has any interest in doing just purely portables, especially at what we would call a short-term cost that is non-recuperable after 5 years, after we put a more permanent solution. I don't think it's a wise use, but I would think we could eliminate that, because hybrid is really going to be the most logical.
I think you're correct. One of the key things, though, is what you just mentioned, is the public comment on that.
Okay.
And while, you know, we would like to, you know, cut out a few things, I think explaining all those things without a preconceived notion to the public is probably important as well. I would happen to guess that they would probably go in a same direction, but I always find bringing a public discussion forward with a preconceived notion of what you think it's already going to be doesn't really mean you're actually asking for public input. So I would rather have us go, hey, here are the options, and yeah, the board's discussed this, but we have time to be able to, you know, in the next month, get those, and I know we're going to talk about how we're going to do that, because that's really what we need to talk about, how we get that information out there, and how we evaluate the public's input.
You also-
That is important for perceptual and for presentation purposes, so we don't get that, oh, did you think of this and did you think of that? But I think they're asking more as far as a planning, as what to evolve over the next few months. I don't think a pure portable solution is something they need to put a lot of time into as far as
But I
coming up with
also,
solutions.
there's going to be another person sitting in this seat, and that person needs to have a chance to look at all options too. I mean, I know at least the one person has come in and met with you, but I just,
But they still need to evolve solutions
Well,
in a
but I mean,
timeframe
there's not a
allowed.
lot of, I mean, this is a pretty finite solution. I mean, the work's been done.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
it's
think we just
there.
leave it
It's
up
not
there.
like there's anything that they would have to do further.
right, I agree with John.
But I think certainly presenting it as, hey, this is an option, you know, that may or may not be a good one for parents. I mean, you know, Karen made some great points about parent concerns and administrative concerns about using portables as an expansion thing, but we need to hear that from from
They need
parents
to see
like that.
everything, I agree.
Okay.
We'll keep it as a part of our thinking and presentation.
Mrs. Belford?
One last request before we move on. Mr. Theodore, you had mentioned, I know, Ms. Henderson's ready to strangle me. You had mentioned when we're looking at effectively full at schools, one of the things that you had mentioned was the idea that if schools are, have significant numbers of students involved in ESE programs, VPK, that sort of thing, is there a way that we could factor that information kind of along the same lines of what Ms. Henderson was saying, where we have programs in schools that are not strict K-12 gen ed classrooms? So for example, when we look at the map, we see the colors, but we don't necessarily know that MILA being at 95% is a much larger concern than Pinewood's not a good example because they have Head Start, than Apollo, or they have ESE too. You get my point, though. Is there a way that we can kind of differentiate to be able to identify those schools that we really should be looking at keeping around 80% as opposed to allowing them to go to 95%?
We previously asked the area superintendents to ask each of their schools if their school could get to 90%. And we received feedback. The vast majority said they could, some said they couldn't, and we have that information. I'm not sure how to tag it on a map.
What I think I heard you say was, we see the capacity. Can we know whether or not capacity is being built on gen ed
Or
or
something else.
the others? And what that balance looks like school by school?
Correct.
Can we do
Yes.
that?
And while I appreciate,
We're going to give it the old college
I'm
try,
not sure.
Mrs.
They
Belford.
have to do it because they know what's in the schools.
They're part of we. So
Yes.
if I
Yeah,
get
I-
the expectation that we get together on it, we'll get together and give it the old college try.
and while, yes, and then I'll give it to you, I promise. While I appreciate the fact that that question was asked, I would just like to add that from the principal's perspective, when the area superintendent or the district leadership comes to them and says, can you function at 90% or 95%? Their answer is going to be yes, because they want to find a way to do it to please their leadership. So asking just strictly, can you function at this level? I'm not sure that we're not still straining our principals and our schools and our communities just because the principal said, yes, they can function at 95%. I think
I agree.
there's a certain element of saying, yes, I can do it because I'm going to do it for the team.
Understand. Just so you understand, as one small nugget to take away, as that assumption goes down, the need goes up. We ran, just as a point of comparison, if it's 155 portables at 90%, at the current capacities, it's 314 portables. So as the ability to get to 90% goes down, our need goes up.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just mention one more thing? I'm sorry.
Briefly.
I'm sorry, but I had mentioned this
Yes,
to
ma'am.
him before.
Yes, ma'am.
And I wanted, I'm very serious about that. There is that one neighborhood off of Vieira Boulevard that is currently being built that is slated to go into Quest, that we really probably, since there's not a house on it, redistrict it to another school before all the building behind. Those 90 homes don't need to be going there if.
We
We've
actually
talked-
looked at that model.
Okay, so just want to put that out there. That, and if you're not going to do it, that's fine, but at least have the discussion, tell me why,
However, great idea.
before they
But
can move
please check with the developer to see, do they sell houses based on, if you build this house, you're going to go there and all of a sudden the house pops up and say,
It doesn't
fooled you, you're
matter.
going, I don't, but it's still as a courtesy to the community. Yes,
in. Yeah, well, I can tell you that it goes on all the time.
I understand, but that's what you're going to get.
Okay. I'm going to run through these last two as quickly as I can to give the board maximum opportunity for questions. So the next category is capital allocations. You recall the workshop goals. Under capital allocations, the first one we're going to talk about is the current 10-year capital funding plan. And it looks like that. The only thing that I want to point out here is the sections of the current 10-year plan, there are basically 5 sections. At the bottom of each year, and I wish I had a pointer here, but at the bottom of each year, the reserve carries up to the carry forward section on the top to start the revenues for the next year. So if you look at 14, 15, 16, the reserve, the bottom number in the reserve will carry forward up to the carry forward in the next year. You then have revenues, you have debt, you have the allocations of the remaining money after the debt, and then what you haven't used as an allocation for a project or funding some support function, you have as remaining reserve, which then carries forward to the next year. What I want to point out here is, and I'm looking at that reserve and I'm looking at the first couple of years on the reserve. So in the yellow, what I do want to point out is that you have 2 categories of unrestricted reserve. You have the first one, remaining unrestricted capital reserve funds, and in FY17, which we're in now, you have 18.643 million, and you have the federally connected needs, which this year have accumulated to 4.8 million. You can see going out in the assumption here by finance is that we're not going to receive any federally connected in the future. I mean, it's just an assumption because, well, it isn't guaranteed. So they have assumed.
It's part of the FEFP.
Yeah, it's part of the FU.
Understand that. I understand that. I believe our lobbyists said that it wasn't guaranteed because they had to fund it. So the assumption in the current, and let me just get through this, in the current 10-year plan is that we're not going to receive federally connected. You'll see in the proposed, it does show that the federally connected going out. But you can see that it goes from 18 to 34 million, 47 million, 58 million. So we're accumulating a lot of unrestricted capital reserve funds. It's important because that's what we're going to be talking about. It's the only source of revenue that we can use to do anything other than what we have in the current 10-year plan. That's what it looks like now. Again, the only purpose for this is to show you that of the current capital allocations, transportation and property insurance and maintenance take up the majority of those in terms of, you can see that programs on the lower left is 1%. There's nothing in there for projects, and there's nothing in there for, on the middle left, school-initiated project match, which I'm going to propose funding. So what this looks like now in terms of a bar chart is that some are fully funded. You can see that the orange, the funding, matches the need, and those are transportation at about $4 million for buses. That was calculated back a few years ago. Property insurance at about $4.6 million. We're funding all of property insurance. PICO in the middle there, PICO, maintenance PICO and CONDS are categorical, so whatever we get in, we allocate that funding. What I want you to look at is the discrepancy between the need and the funding for things like ET, these support functions, ET, facility renewal, programs. You can see huge discrepancy. Projects, there's a need and no funding for. So basically, what that shows is there's about a $44 million calculated request/need and about $21 million worth of current funding for that. So what I want to talk about here is the proposal for capital allocations. To talk about how we allocate money from our capital fund, you have to talk about strategy. What is the strategy that was used for our current allocations, and then what strategy are we going to use for the proposed allocations? Well, if you recall, the previous strategy that was used to develop the current capital allocations in that plan was to minimize capital allocations to support functions, programs, and projects to maximize reserves for new capacity without debt. You may recall Dr. Bingley in a March 2015 workshop presented a capital plan that showed by basically minimizing the allocations to support functions, programs, and projects, that we could accumulate this unrestricted capital reserve to be used in conjunction with impact fees to fund 2 new schools without debt. The current strategy that I'd like to go through very quickly that I'm proposing that we're using as the basis for our proposed allocation plan is based on 2 objectives that I'm responsible for, 3A and 3C. 3A basically says that we will form a capital advisory committee, we will prioritize our capital requirements, equitably allocate available capital resources, and develop a long-range capital plan. I put check marks next to each of those because all of those have been done at this point. Objective 3C is the allocation of capital funding to ensure equitable access to programs. Allocation of capital funding to provide equitable capacity accommodations, that's the new capacity needs, and develop a long-range capital plan around those 2 elements. And I didn't put check marks next to those because those have not been done at this point. We have not come up with a plan to, at this point. Yes, ma'am.
Who's on the committee?
He's going to explain the next slide.
Yes,
Okay.
the next slide, this is a 2-stage process. I believe we have formed a capital advisory committee that is essentially the superintendent's cabinet to form preliminary recommendations, to prioritize and form preliminary recommendations. We will be asking you what the next step looks like in terms of, because we had to have a basis to come forward to you to proceed, and the next step would be public input to that process. So what the superintendent's cabinet has done is prioritize annual allocation categories, propose projects, and develop preliminary allocation recommendations. This comes in 2 ways. We have annual capital funding that would go out. Each year you would annually fund this category, and those come in several flavors. They come in, as I said, the CONDS and PICO, which I mentioned before, categoricals. They must by statute be used for very specific, in some cases life safety, but basically maintenance projects. The property insurance, so we've ranked those as 1s. They must be used as a categorical. We have some projects or some allocations that are 2s. ADA, you have to do something. You don't have to do 100,000. Bus replacements, we've put it $4 million to have a renewal program for buses, and that could be funded at $1 million or $6 million. Capital renewal, the $11 million represents the remaining portion that was not funded by, do you recall I say $27 million on a 25-year renewal program for our facilities. The sales surtax was limited to the 16 categories of the 33 facilities categories that were considered mission critical. So I really do not have enough money to do the remaining 17 categories. That represents, on the assessment, about $11 million of that $27 million a year. Ed Tech, we've calculated that to do on an 8-year renewal cycle, they need about $6 million, and you can see over in the current amount they're getting about 1.8. Same with facility renewal, capital renewal, 2.488. FF&E, we're a little short of where I'm recommending. Maintenance supplies, that's just to keep the maintenance department going. We're about $1 million short of what we spend every year. The portable relocations, I have put together an estimate based on that blended recommendation to address capacity issues by moving portables each year to address capacity issues until we can have enough funding to do new capacity, to fund new capacity. And instead of the $250 that we get on an annual basis for portable relocations, I believe we'll need about $770,000 next year. Again, depending on what schools, what capacity utilization schools can get to. There is no funding currently for programs. CTE has put forward a $20 million 5-year program, which I've just put at $4 million a year roughly on the average. And I'm recommending a supplemental funding for school-initiated projects, which is what we've talked about in the past, and as a follow-up to the early funding for the Endeavor Canopy. So I would propose that as a continuing funding program. The $300,000 was based on the average for the last 5 years of school-initiated project volume. I can tell you that this past year, which I didn't have the numbers for, we did $440,000 at our schools and school-initiated projects. So that number may increase, and there may not be a match. It may be a first-come, first-serve at $300,000. And energy conservation, I have funded at $150,000, and I'm proposing to eliminate that and just make it a project as funding becomes available.
Do you want us to comment at this point?
Yes, ma'am.
FF&E, is that furniture and fixtures?
Furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to comment on the ADA. There was a ADA complaint filed at Rockledge on the stadium because it was not compliant. We have other stadiums with the same issue. One of them is at Satellite that I've complained for 12 years at, and was never done even when the total $39 million remodel of Satellite, because I was told it was too expensive to get done. And so I've got a person at Satellite that's ready to file with ADA, and I had a call from Cocoa Beach from another family that wants to file ADA because they saw that it's getting done at Rockledge. People are frustrated that it takes an ADA complaint to get equity in the stadiums. And so is $100,000 going to be enough? Because we have 2 more stadiums that need to be done, and people are going to file if that's what it takes to get done.
What I would say is that the $100,000 is a ongoing. We have an ADA committee. They spend about $100,000 a year, more or less, based on continuing yearly accommodation requests. It does not come close to matching the need or the funding required for a stadium ADA renovation. The one at the 2-phase renovation at McClarty will be on the order of $350,000, and I would expect similar amounts for Cocoa and Satellite, if
Cocoa
not
Beach.
more, each. And so what I would propose is that that be a project as opposed to an annual funding on an as-needed basis, and you can see that we show that as I'll have down in that yellow, it says McClarty Field ADA Phase 2 renovation at $200,000. That's the second phase, our first phase, which was funded out of just capital. This
But I
year
don't
was
see the other
$150,000.
stadiums on there, so do the families need to file a complaint for that to happen?
If the board requests us to fund that, we would not wait for a complaint and simply put it on as a project.
So I guess I'm asking the board, do I
So
need?
we can't do that right here.
We can take a note of what the suggestion is, and as we finalize our plan,
We would come back.
Okay, so when is the proper time for me to bring this forward then, Dane?
Ma'am, you just have,
just did.
and
Okay.
we will bring that forward at the
Okay.
January recommendation.
But I'm not going to be here in January. We'll take care.
So noted. So noted, your issue is noted, and we will bring that back as a recommendation.
Okay, because otherwise I'm going to make sure the complaints are filed, so thank you.
The FF&E,
I'm sorry? FF&E, yes.
yes. So could you give us a little bit more detail about where that would be?
I can. Currently, we were not, as a little history, we were not funding FF&E for about 4 or 5 years. We started a program of $100,000 in each of the 3 area superintendent areas to give them some money for furniture. So that's 300 of the current 500,000. We also have in there 50,000 for ancillary facilities, and we have 150,000 for custodial equipment, which is, we provide equipment to schools to help replace their custodial equipment. What I proposed is $150,000 additional for grounds equipment, which is, I just had a dump truck that broke and is $80,000. So I need a continuing fund for that. So I'm proposing an additional $150,000 for that. I'll go on to the proposed capital projects. You may recall that we have committed to the air conditioning of the Jefferson Gym, and that is currently, I think, being completed. What that means then is the remaining 4 middle school gyms, we would need a commitment to do those as special projects or projects. We have 2 coming up in the next year's sales surtax projects where we take advantage of a reduction in cost because they're tagging onto a sales surtax project. So that would be a $600,000 commitment for this year. The ESC boardroom audio and podium upgrades is, I believe, it was ranked number 1 priority. I believe the board supports that. The others were air-conditioned 2 high school locker rooms and 2, they were not, well, they're ranked as 2s. There's the COCO replacement building. At COCO, there are 2 elements. There's a replacement building for the current building 18, I believe, which houses the CTE spaces. And there's a proposal to use impact fees to build new capacity. This would be new classroom capacity. So we can fund that with impact fees. This would be a non-impact fee project.
And where would that be?
At COCO. So there would be a proposed 2-story addition.
I'm sorry, I was back on the lockers.
I'm sorry, the lockers.
The locker rooms.
Lockers are at O'Galley. There are 2 non-air-conditioned locker rooms in high schools, O'Galley and Rockledge.
Okay, so it's my understanding that at O'Galley, that used to be there where the aviation school is now, that used to be the weight room, and that they're getting that back.
If a new building is built.
So why are we, I understand why it's on here. I guess my concern is that we still have middle school.
We have 7 middle schools without air-conditioned gyms.
Exactly. So we're going to do this. For a locker room, how much time did they spend in there? I mean, I understand that it's hot, but these kids spend the entire hour in a gym. And when you go in a locker room, you actually change clothes. So I don't know how this got to be such a high priority. That's my question.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I know you didn't make the priorities. I know you guys did it as a team. I'm just saying, I don't see that as, that's an interesting priority.
Yes, ma'am.
That it would
I
be
will-
number 1.
I will answer that question. Typically, after working out, you don't, even though you shower, your body doesn't cool down right away. You still continue to sweat. And then you're going to put your clothes on and walk out, and you're going to continue to sweat. The sooner you cool down, the better. Now, can they get away with some high-power fans? I don't know.
They already have them.
The ESC security upgrades were ranked a number 2. There was a perception that there was a request and a need for upgrades here at the ESF, and transportation as requested routing software, and that was proposed at half this year to start to come up with enough funding for that next year. And again, ESC server upgrades were, security upgrades were funded at proposed funding at $100,000. I have ongoing needs in the bottom there in the yellow that must be done this year, and basically what I said to the committee was that if I received enough facility funding, I would just take care of them and take them off this list because we were trying to prioritize them. What I want to show you here, this is the critical slide in this series, and that is there is only one place to get whatever funding is deemed appropriate by the board for additional capital allocations from our current funding plan, and that is the unrestricted capital reserves and the federally connected. What I've shown, so you can see that Under the current plan, it builds up to quite an amount, 58 million in a couple of years out. So I have recommended, the committee has set priorities, and we did some testing of what we could do. The requests actually added up to, between the current funding and the projects, added up to about 22 million. And that didn't leave any reserve. At 75%, it left, we believe, not enough. So there's been a recommendation to, in many cases, fund those requests at about 50%, resulting in about a $12 million increase to the allocations annually and for some projects, leaving a funding reserve of about $10 million this year that stretches out, obviously, into the out years. But this is for 16, 17. With that, the specific increases are, as you can see, for ET, there's about $2.3 million in additional funding, 4.2 for facilities, 150 for FF&E, which we spoke about. Maintenance supplies to keep maintenance going was $1 million. 520 in the portable relocations. That's to execute that option, that blend of options that we talked about. $2 million for programs, 1.75 for projects, and about 300,000 for school-initiated projects. The ones in yellow would have to come back and be validated for alignment with the strategic plan. The projects I've put in at half of the requested amount, so that those projects that we just talked about, instead of 3.5 million, they're at 175. The same with the programs. Instead of 4 million, they're at 2 million. And the same holds true for ET and facility renewal. All of those are at 50% of the requested or calculated need amount. Then what this looks like, you may recall that slide a few slides ago where we looked at the need versus the funding. If you added the 12 million, you come up with 33 million in funding versus 44 million in need. And you can see that the needs versus the funding are a lot closer on many categories, and in fact, in some categories are 100% funded. That's a look at the annual capital allocation, proposed capital allocation pie chart. It looks a lot more balanced. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see on the left-hand side, the projects are at 5%, programs are at 7%. FF&E is in there at 2%, and whereas the school-initiated projects is at 1%. The relationship, I was asked to go through this, and I'm going to go through it very quickly. The relationship of this proposed capital funding plan is this. In 2014, because there are a lot of questions revolving around this, we did a facility assessment that was 721 million. The sales surtax funded about 160 million of the facilities need of 721. I put that 160 million of funded sales surtax funded projects in our educational plant survey. The 5-year district facility work program is an extraction of the educational plant survey. If you think of the survey as the menu, you order dinner that year in your 5-year plan. That's kind of an analogy that I've used. So basically, we're drawing from what we're going to do in the next 5 years for the out of the educational plant survey in that district facility work program. And basically, the only relation between our funding plan and the 5-year plan, the only relation is the first year must match, and we use the 10-year capital funding program that you have in front of you there to project in the 5-year plan the revenue sources and the uses of those sources. So while there's a direct relationship between them, the only one that has to match directly is the first year. and then we look at what we project for the following 4 years, and put that in the 5-year district facility work program. It's a fairly complicated document that's not easy to read, so if you just know that if you look at the 10-year capital plan, that is what's in the 5-year facility work program to the state.
Before we head to impact fees at this point, one of the primary kind of questions we're asking on behalf of staff is board thoughts on the use of approximately $12 million in unrestricted capital to be equitably distributed around those functions, programs, and projects that Dane alluded to earlier. Kind of a yes or no, and anything else the board would like to share.
I don't see it as an issue with the amount. I don't know that there's enough detail to say, yeah, go do all the things you want to do, because I'm not really sure what it is you're asking to do.
Much of it still must be vetted. He mentioned alignment to the strategic plan, and we do want to do community input. So at this time, it's a conceptual thought with a lot more work to be done to finalize the recommendation we bring back.
Mrs. Nisi.
I just want to go back to page 41 for a minute and just express my disappointment to several of you around the table. Because back in July, both Mrs. Klein, Dr. Kent, Dr. Mullins, Mrs. Irwin, and Dr. Blackburn, you and I, and all of us attended a very difficult meeting with a group of parents back at Holland Elementary School. And without going back through that incident, also a year before that, Dr. Blackburn, one of the first things you did when you moved into your office here was that solid door. You took out the top half of that and put a window in that because you felt it was very important that people could see what you were doing behind that door. And many of those parents in that room looked at us and said, will you promise that you do everything in the future to ensure that our children are safe? And we all looked them in the eyes and said, absolutely, we will do that. And one of the first things that I said to all of you was I looked at those offices and I said, I have a problem that many of our older buildings have solid doors, that it is too easy in these older buildings for a principal, assistant principal, or dean to go into an office, shut the door, and nobody can see what goes on behind those doors, including that school. And those of you on the cabinet, many of you were in the meeting, and I see windows in school offices has a priority of 3. I don't know what to say to that.
But the locker rooms have it too.
Yeah.
What I'll say is staff worked. You have a recommendation in front of you. You can provide us input and we'll revise accordingly. That's what I'll say.
Well, you know how I feel. I think that the safety of our children should have a priority of 1. And I think that should be taken under consideration, that windows and having whoever's meeting with our children behind closed doors should have a window in them, period.
Mrs. Melford.
I'm with Mr. Ziegler in stating that the dollar amount, I guess the devil is in the details. And some of this information that has been put forth, I think in order for us to really provide a recommendation as to direction on, we need additional details. For example, ESF security upgrades. I'm not sure what that is, but if we're looking at $100,000 towards windows and doors or $100,000 towards security here for adults as opposed to keeping children safe, if we had additional detail, I think I would be better able to look at this and say, this is the direction that I feel that we should go. And yes, I agree with this priority rating, or no, I don't agree with this priority rating. So for me anyway, that that would be very helpful.
I agree. That's 3 of us.
Got it.
4 of us. Next.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Craig?
I think Ms. Belford still
Oh,
had something to say.
I just had a question on the slide with the yellow and the green, and it says, final recommendations for the highlighted items are subject to validation and alignment with the strategic plan. Does that mean that the green items have been validated for alignment with the strategic plan?
The The projects have the projects have not been validated per se with the alignment. I would say that I could change that to a yellow.
And so the FF and E aligns with our strategic plan?
Yes, it does.
Could we maybe, I'm just, and I get there are things that we need in place. There again, I think if we had additional detail on what that is, it would be a lot easier for me to justify supporting. When we're looking at $250,000 for windows and doors to keep kids safe, or we're looking at $150,000 in furniture, and I'm not saying either one is more justified than another, it's just that I don't have enough detail to truly make that determination from my perspective.
Got it.
Mr. Craig?
So I just had two quick things. Mr. Theodore and I have gone over this quite a bit, and he's put together a good plan. And he knows, and I've talked to Dr. Blackburn as well, one of my reservations, or one of my criteria, I wouldn't say reservation, but one of my criteria in supporting the entire bigger picture capital plan is that we continue to explore. One of the things was other avenues, which we discussed in the last segment, but also other revenues. I went back and went over to I got with the property appraiser's office, and I got us the entire list of properties and mapped them all out and found where they're at. And it is amazing how many pieces of property we own that have nothing to do with a student in this district. Why we hang on to some of them, I don't know. And I don't think anybody probably at this table even has an idea of where we own. We own oceanfront property, oceanfront, literally, that we can do with whatever we want with. That's probably not a good example of what we need to do, but what I would like to see this board do is give direction to put out an invitation to bid to commercial realtors to bid on the opportunity to represent us, to divest ourselves of the excess property that we have so that we can bring more revenue in. Mr. Theodore has started and good on him. He's trying to do that and about 10 other things, but that's where we need to be giving guidance to the superintendent to say, hey, look, there are companies out here. That's what they do. Let's put out a bid to get either one or two. We can have an IDIQ type of contract with several different commercial property or commercial property agents that then can go and market these properties appropriately so that we can get the revenue in. I can tell you that the places that I've driven by, let's take the one on North, up in Cape Canaveral.
Really?
That's beautiful.
And the city of Cape Canaveral is interested in it.
The city of Cape Canaveral wants us to give it to them.
Yeah,
We
that's
have a
in
piece
there.
of property, up on North Merritt Island that sits right next to a building that you all have received information on that they've been trying to sell us to build a school at. We own the property right next door, huge piece of property that we will never use. So it's items like that where I think we need to be aggressive and go, hey, look, before we go and make these allocation agreements or these allocation recommendations, we have to let everybody know that we have totally exhausted every revenue resource that we have. This is a prime example of, and while some of them may only get, $50,000, $60,000, you add up those $50,000, $60,000, it's a lot of money. And some of them sit right in neighborhoods that have houses all around them that we would, they're too small to ever do anything on, that we can actually get some revenue from. I think it's important that we do that from a financial and a fiscal standpoint, but also from a public perception standpoint of, hey, we are doing everything we can to exhaust every opportunity to get the revenue that we have. We're sitting on this stuff. Let's do that. And then I think the other item I had was, no, I think that was it.
And to your point, John, we've missed some, in my opinion, we've missed some opportunities because the decision was made and never rose to our level, which, remember, we gave direction that in the future, even if the recommendation is not to take the opportunity, we should be made aware of the opportunity.
Correct, but I think we need to go one step further now. Instead of waiting for people to come to us, we need to be, we need to be in the sell mode. We need to go, hey, look, we don't need this stuff anymore. It's not going to give us anything down the line. There's no reason for us to hold on to it. Let's see what the market will bear. And then we can make the decisions on an individual basis. You're exactly right, but I don't want to sit back anymore.
No, and I think we had this conversation probably about 4 or 5 years ago, but the market was very depressed then, so timing is a lot better now.
And Ms. Neeson brings up a great point. And once you put it back in the market, now it has potential tax revenue as well. So.
That's true. I'm good with that. Okay.
How about
anything?
providing us a map with all those properties?
I will send it to you, right there. It's pretty cool.
I bet. I know there's a lot out there. I mean, I've looked at it. But I
Right.
don't know where they all were.
Okay, what's next? Dr. Blackburn. Go for it.
Next. You have 4 minutes, sir.
Just say yes, we can.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. As you know, the county has proposed an impact fee ordinance change. The essence of that is reduce 4 benefit districts to 2 and change the impact fee amount to 50% of the amounts recommended in the 2015 impact fee study that they had undertaken. Those are the current boundaries, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the proposed 2 boundaries, two districts, north and south, basically on the mainland. That's south of Rockledge, where that one begins. This is the proposed fee schedule at 50% of the study, and what this one essentially does is increase the single family slightly and reduce the multifamily and multi-home dramatically. The essence of that is that the amounts received based on the current mix of single family, multifamily, and mobile home would be about the same or very slightly, depending on the amount of single family homes, very slightly increased in terms of revenue. So effectively, it is relating the impact fee study fee schedule to a percentage so that there's some relationship, and keeping the impact fee revenues to us as close to the same as possible. Proposed resolution, effectively the resolution before you tonight as consent and was before you at the last meeting as information says that you will support the Brevard County proposed educational facilities impact fee ordinance and request the Board of County Commissioners to hold a public hearing at the conclusion of the 1-year continuation to consider and approve the educational ordinance, impact fee ordinance change. That meeting occurs on October 4th at their regular commission meeting. I got a copy of the advance agenda and it is on there. So the staff has updated the impact fee ordinance. Once again, it was on there for public hearing last October 6th, continued a year, and it's back on there on October 4th with an updated ordinance. Basically just the dates of when it would be effective. The proposed use of impact fees, I'm going to get through this as quickly as I can, but essentially what this slide is showing you is that if you assume that the impact fee ordinance will be changed on October 4th to change the impact fee benefit districts from 4 to 2, what is possible is over the course of the next 5 years, is to fully fund 2 elementary schools, if that's the direction, if that's the need, and that's the direction that the board chooses to go, that it is possible to fully fund 2 elementary schools with impact fees and do some additional improvements, address additional needs in areas, benefit districts 3 and 4. And I'll go through that as quickly as I can. In benefit district 2, I'm going to start with, because that is the perceived first need, the first school we believe, given our current information, would occur in the central area, in the Viera area. We would take the impact fees that have not been collected in 2014-15, they've been collected at the county, not received by us. 14-15, 15-16, and the first half of 16-17, because if the impact fee ordinance is changed in October, it would take effect in January. That's half of our fiscal year. That would total $6.192 million. The second half, we would combine benefit districts 1 and 2 receipts for $3 million, and then assume 17, 18, 18, 19, the $6.149 million. All of the projections for this year and the following years are based on what we collected in 2015-16 last year. We collected approximately $7.6 million in impact fees, and the only assumption that I could make is that we would continue to collect the same amount in the out years. Benefit District 1, which would be the south area, we had $706,000 that was reserved when we collected our fees in 13-14. We would do the same thing that we talked about for Area 2, except we would start those collections in 19, 20, 20, 21, and have approximately enough. I mean, the 21 million, they're about, the target would be 20 million, and you can see we would just move a little bit of money from Area Central Benefit District. We would move a little bit from what would be 2 to 1. Available COCO, high school addition, you can see we would use the same strategy for Benefit District 3, combining 3 and 4 for the second half of 16-17 and 1 additional year, 17-18, to accumulate $4.5 million, which would give us a 10 classroom, 10, 11, possibly 12 classroom addition, depending on the configuration and the price at that time, at Cocoa High. That would be what we talked about in terms of the new capacity, not the replacement of the existing building for CTE, which is shown there as a project. Benefit District 4, there is no project that is currently shown in the proposed five-year district facilities plan, which is a requirement for the use of impact fees, so that the strategy there would be to collect those revenues in District 4 through the first half of 16-17 for $1.29 million and pay debt with that and use that for other facilities-related program needs, perhaps reconfiguration of a school of choice. You can see that in 18-19 through 2021, there is no color on that, so that would be open to anything in the north area, basically north of Rockledge. It could be, again, used to pay debt and put forward to program-related needs. Alternative uses, you can pay debt. I mean, that is effectively, what I've just shown you here in that previous slide is a recommendation to address some capacity issues in districts 1, 2, and 3. What we're doing in 4 is paying debt, so that is the alternative use. The board can choose to simply pay debt with all of that money and use the funds that were planned to pay debt and use it for other capital needs.
Mrs. Belford, did that answer your question on the Cocoa High new versus replacement? Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Craig?
I forgot to ask you this before. When you say mobile home, how is that defined? Is that a manufactured home? Is that
Yes.
a truly a movable home?
Manufactured.
Manufactured home. So it's a planned, semi-permanent structure that could be moved?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. The hybrid solution that we kind of discussed quite a bit, I guess, you know, it just kind of popped in. I forgot to ask you, and I think your explanation again stirred, you know, maybe the thought. So if we went with a hybrid solution, is there a way for us to get an idea of what the true cost of that would be? You know, you've given us an example here that basically sets aside money for 2 schools. But if we went with a hybrid solution of capacity and all that other stuff that we talked about, what would actually the money be available for debt service? And I know that's not, you know, that's more of a fight, you know, the CFO question, but I'd like to get that information. I'd like to figure out where those numbers exist. I mean, it's obvious we can figure that out. I mean, but it's going to be based on whatever that hybrid solution truly, you know, is defined. But maybe a couple different, you know, probabilities or ways that we might address it, utilizing the various methods in that hybrid thing, and then coming back with, hey, so what's left in those pots? In the, you know, if we separate into 2, what's left in those, so that we then have another option of what we can do to either pay down debt or expand more capacity or whatever it is in another area.
So you're suggesting in current benefit district 1 and 2, take a look at hybrid, cost it, and look
Right.
at other options for using.
As Mr. Theodore just said, this is just an example of one solution. What I'd like to see is an example like this for maybe the hybrid solution. And realizing that there might be 1 or 2 different scenarios in there, so you might have to do a couple of different scenarios that are the most logical to give us, you know, kind of a better idea where those numbers might sit.
Could you also bring us the information on the impact fees since we started using it for only paying debt? Since we, you know, for like the last 10 years or 8 years? We were saving it for a while, and then we used it to pay debt because we didn't have any money to pay
Yes.
debt. So could you bring us that information?
Yes, certainly.
By year
Yes,
totals?
it's,
district and all that
every
sort of
time,
stuff.
every time we come forward with a recommendation for use of impact fees, that historical
Right,
information included, I can certainly give
Yeah,
that to you.
just forward that to us.
I know that we're past our time. I would just like to go through this
You're
very,
done.
very quickly with you, ma'am.
Do we have,
Sir?
do we have a time certain for the 4th? Did they give us a time certain in the agenda at all, or?
They did not. It's on the public hearing at the end of the meeting.
Okay. End of the meeting, so it could be any time.
Well, a request may result in a time certain. I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure it's necessary, is it?
Future activities relative to future activities relative to these 3 items that we talked about. Obtain public input, October through December, validate the capacity issues with the new enrollment projections. Those will be generated based on our final FTE count and input from the local governments and the process that we go through, as I mentioned, coming out in about mid to late November. So we will have new capacity projections, and that will figure into our final recommendations to you in January. Validate funding requests in alignment with the strategic plan, which is what we talked about for those new allocation proposals, and present the findings and final recommendations to the board in January. All of those 3 previous activities taking place October through December. Request for board direction. We've asked at the conclusion of each of those 3 categories your preferred option to address projected capacity issues. We think we've heard your answers, preferred use of remaining capital reserves, preferred use of impact fees, and what we would like to ask at this point is what you would like us to do relative to the next step on public input. What does that model look like?
Any thoughts?
So I've been giving this quite a bit of thought. I think one of the best things we did was about a year and a half ago, and we did a individual district forums, public forums, where we explained funding and some other issues as a board member, but we did it so that we, and we didn't attend each other's, so that we could interact and discuss things that we were going to vote on with the public. Those were very well received, and I think watching Dr. Blackburn and his the way he has interacted with the community, I would like to see the superintendent and each board member hold a forum, it only has to be one in each district, that brings this forward. We put out some read-aheads through social media, through all the different avenues to make sure we get things out there, all the different options, what it is we're actually going to discuss, and what it is that we're actually going to ask people for input on. And have the board member and the superintendent there to interact, explain what we've done in our workshop, what we're the road that we're kind of looking at going down based on all these different options, and get the parental and get the community input to then truly come back and discuss in another workshop forum. Okay, where does it all go? Or we have the superintendent and his staff put together. Where does it all go? What does this all mean? Where are the spikes of concern? Is there a pretty much logical conclusion that much of the community is going for? But I think by going out and doing that, we do the right thing, and we bring the solutions, and we say, okay, here's what we've discussed. What do you think? And then we collect that information, and then we make our best decision. And of course, you're not going to please all the people, but we certainly need to get that input so that we have some level of understanding from the north to the south what the concerns are and what the preferred direction is that we go for the next, because it needs to be more than a short-term solution. We realize it needs to be long-term. Let's get that input so that we understand what the concerns are.
That always works well. However, I've never really felt like participation has been where it should be. So we need to figure out how to increase that participation.
I agree. We need to get a much better, I don't need teachers there. Well, I mean, I need teachers there.
We don't need
I don't need the
choir.
principals there just to be a body in a seat. If they're interested, that's great. I don't need the staff there. We need truly the community to be involved. And if obviously if students and parents and teachers and everybody is truly involved, but you're right, we need to get that message out better. We need to make sure that they are set at a time and a place that we can truly get some good participation.
Why don't we reach out to all the municipalities in those areas and ask them to be our partners in this
That's great.
forum?
And I think teachers and principals really should be there because they're the ones who will.
I
potentially
agree. I
be
just don't
in-
want to
be in-
tell them that they have
No,
to
no,
be
no.
there. That
No,
was
but
my
they're the
point.
ones who will
So
have to deal with the extra
I
capacity.
hope that they show up.
and
I want them to be there.
be
I
the
just don't
ones
want
that
to
are
go,
in
hey, you have to be
portables
here.
And it may take more than one meeting depending on your district, like
It might,
mine's
yeah.
Beach and all the way
Yeah.
down to Fairfax. And it may need to be a couple different times.
Yeah, it may very
and-
well be.
Time frame? Are we talking January for this?
No, we
Before-
probably
You gotta
need
do
to
this
do,
now.
Pretty soon.
You gotta do that this next month.
It would have to be
October or November, I would.
November, December be hard.
Yeah, late October, early
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I just,
You
I wanna-
mentioned municipalities, we reach out to other groups as well, Rotary, Kiwanis.
Well,
anyone
the
that can
municipalities have already expressed concern, so we want to make sure they're included in promoting and participating.
help. Will do.
Yep.
Okay, anything else before we
Anything else? You got 1 minute.
take a breather?
So.
We'll give it back to the board.
Okay, that meeting's adjourned now.